Great. We're at 12:03 p.m. Thank you everybody for joining. Just so you know, we've got 132 people here, which I think really highlights how important all of this is. Um, my name's Armand Domblewski. I am a board member at Seamless Bay Area, and I'll be moderating the call today. Seamless Bay Area is a grassroots organization. We advocate for world-class integrated public transit system by advancing policy reforms and building a grassroots movement for change. This is a really precarious moment for Bay Area transit. I miss it so much that I'm really just standing outside of BART trains all day, as you can see. And for the future of our region, we've got plummeting ridership and revenues causing deep service cuts that are at risk of becoming permanent. So it's especially important to stay engaged, and I'm especially grateful for all of you in this difficult time for being with us. Like, I'm just seeing the number tick up and up of the amount of people joining in, and I'm really grateful. So one thing I'm really thrilled about is to have Assemblymember David Chiu of San Francisco, who is now my Assemblymember, to talk about how we can help our transit system recover from the COVID-19 crisis, as well as current efforts to make Bay Area transit more connected, equitable, and sustainable. You might remember that Assemblymember Chiu was the author of AB 2057, the Bay Area Seamless Transit Act, a bill that was sponsored by Seamless Bay Area to create an integrated transit system for our region. It was unfortunately postponed due to the COVID-19 crisis, which was a very sad day for all of us, but we understood that, the nature of the crisis. Assemblymember Chiu was also the Assembly lead for Regional Measure 3, which was a major transit funding initiative. And he's one of the most effective advocates for Bay Area transit in the California legislature. We could not be more grateful for support and advocacy, and super excited for him to be here. But what I'm personally most excited about is that we have a broad range of people, transportation leaders, staff, and advocates today as well. We have a huge number of people on the line right now. I think it's 144. And we had almost 300 RSVPs, and more people are joining. We've got staff from BART, SFMTA, AC Transit, lots of other agencies, city officials from Fairfield to Cupertino to Contra Costa County, where I was born, as well as legislative staff and representatives of advocacy and disability groups. I've seen firsthand how all these folks are fighting incredibly hard right now at great risk to themselves, to make sure that the rest of us are taken care of. And I'm really grateful for them to be here. In order for the Bay Area Transit to recover from this crisis, we're going to need everyone working together. So thank you for joining in this effort. Today, you'll be hearing from Adina Levin, Seamless Bay Area's Director of Advocacy, and Ian Griffiths, our Policy Director, about the current status of Bay Area Transit, as well as lessons we can learn from the transit systems around the world. Assemblymember Chiu is going to talk about opportunities to advance our transit goals at the state and federal level, as well as the MTC's new Blue Ribbon Task Force. And we'll also be providing 3 key actions that you can take right now to stay involved and engaged in this work in the coming weeks and months. So before we get started, a few logistical notes. We invite everyone on the call to submit comments or questions through the Zoom chat function as presentations are taking place. We'll be reserving 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of today's session if you'd rather wait and raise your hand to ask a question live. We're going to answer as many questions as we can while being mindful of everybody's time. And I especially ask that if you have a question, you put it into the question section rather than the general comments. We'll try to get to everything, but it's just going to be easier to sort of manage specific questions in that portion. So in addition, after today's call, we'll be sending you an email of to all webinar participants that includes a summary of the information you'll be hearing today, as well as follow-ups on actions you can take. With that, I'll turn it over to Ian Griffiths, Seamless Bay Area Co-Founders Policy Director, and Adina Levin, Seamless Bay Area's Director of Advocacy. Thank you so much, Ian and Adina. Take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Armand. So we'll start by giving a little bit of an overview of what the status of Bay Area transportation is right now. Here's a map of our region's 27 different transit agencies, and as you can see, the ridership is down between 70 and 90% across, or even greater than 90% across most of our current transit operators. The declines have been in place really since April and have started to recover very slowly, but this is very much the scale of the declines. And in addition to, and this is of course primarily because of the shelter-in-place order and the public health advisories, transit agencies have responded in many cases with major service cuts out of necessity and out of the interest of public health and the health of operators operating the system. And these cuts have varied by agency, sometimes reducing the number of hours, closing early, reducing frequencies. They've been done on an agency by agency basis out of necessity. But the impact has been very significant for riders, especially those that still have to get around. 30% of all transit commuters during normal times are considered essential workers or are within the job categories of essential workers. These include people who work at grocery stores and restaurants, as well as healthcare workers. And we've been in touch and talking with a number of different groups that have and people providing transit. I mean, I personally have been able to shelter in place and have not been able to use transit, but in our discussions with groups and people that are, we are hearing that this service is having a major impact, long waits for service due to the reduced amounts of service. Oftentimes buses in particular will be full, they'll have reached their capacity and they'll pass people up that are waiting at the curb, resulting in even greater uncertainty. It makes transferring between multiple services very uncertain. We heard one anecdote of someone who said that their transit trip normally takes 45 minutes and involves one transfer, and as a result of a bus passing them up, they took them over 2 hours to get home. And having to ultimately resort to an Uber or Lyft to get home. And real uncertainty as to just how to ride transit. You know, that people are calling in to transit agencies and advocacy groups just wanting more information as to how one actually uses transit and if it's safe. Transit app is a mobile app, and they did a study recently of who is left riding transit based on who is using their app. And that is not a perfect cross-section of the entire population, but they find that of people that are using their app, there's been a big shift among those who are left riding transit. And they find that those who are left are predominantly women, people of color, and the poor. And that's a big shift. Even those groups are even more represented now than they were prior to the shelter-in-place order going in place. So this is definitely having a very significant impacts on those populations. Our transit system and the declines in ridership is having a big impact on the financial situation of our transit agencies, and that's going to play into how quickly we can recover. The way transit is funded currently makes it especially vulnerable. This diagram is a complicated image, but essentially on the left, you have the various different funding sources that fund operating service. And then on the right, you have the Bay Area transit agencies, and everything is scaled to the approximate size of their budgets and operations. Each transit agency has a different mix of funding sources, including fare box, local sales tax, local sources, state sources, and each are going to have a different financial impact depending on what their particular mix is. But the biggest funding sources are fare box, making up 34% of all revenue sources, and sales tax. And those are the two that are most affected by this crisis, particularly when ridership is down by 90%. You can imagine fare box revenue is down by 90 or more %, particularly when fares aren't even being collected on many of these transit agencies. So our ability to recover is going to depend on our transit agencies having sufficient funds to continue to provide service and to implement a number of different policies that Adina will talk further about that will make transit safer. We have received some funding through the Federal CARES Act. 1.3 billion was allocated by Congress. That is extremely important. That's been allocated, but NTC estimates that over the next 18 months of lower ridership, they anticipate at least another 1.3 billion will be needed to avoid major service cuts. briefly, how does this compare to other places in the world? We did a little bit of, we've been doing some research on that to understand this. And those drops of 80 and 90% are pretty typical in cities like Beijing, Barcelona, London, and New York, places that have put in place these shelter in place and major lockdowns. Like basically there's no demand for transit, and those drops are pretty typical. Those cities that have avoided those major drops are those places where they haven't had to implement, where they haven't implemented major lockdowns, and where in the cases of Seoul and Taipei, they've been able to, through very coordinated, comprehensive public health strategies, been able to avoid those extremely drastic measures. Those have been combined with very strong campaigns to make transit safe as well. But overall, we see that the ability to bring people back to transit really is going to be connected to our ability to do these other broader public health measures that will reduce the need for social distancing, because of course, social distancing really limits the extent to which we can get people onto transit vehicles in the numbers where transit makes sense and can actually function effectively. So very recently, just some BART, this is a recent data from BART's current board meeting that was today. They're beginning to see ridership creep back up as the restrictions begin to be lifted. But car traffic, the stats say that our car traffic is coming back much faster, which is not surprising. Bay Bridge traffic volume is only down 41% now from pre-COVID levels as compared to the 80 to 90% drops on transit. While there's still not very much congestion right now, we know that as the demand for travel picks back up, our economic recovery will very much depend on transit's ability to operate and operate at a significant capacity, not at a significantly reduced capacity. There was a study that came out recently that said that if 3 out of 4 transit riders switched to driving, the average Bay Area commute would increase by 42 minutes. And that was the highest in the entire nation, showing just how important transit is in particular to the functioning of our region. BART has mapped out a number of scenarios, just using BART as an example here. They've done a lot of sophisticated thinking as to how transit ridership could recover. Their most optimistic scenario is that over the next 12 months, that they'll achieve 50% of ridership, of normal ridership. That's their most optimistic scenario. Their more pessimistic scenario is that it would only be about 15% over the next 12 months. And even beyond that, ramp up to only between 60 and 80% of regular levels, even looking forward more than 12 months from now. Turn it over to Adina now.
Mm-hmm. So given the financial issues and the potential bumpy increase in ridership, there are pretty severe risks to the ability to recover the transit system. The slide that we're looking at is something that was presented to the Caltrain board last week, Thursday, going through scenarios of recovery. And one of the scenarios that that staff described to the board is the potential for deliberate or financially compelled shutdown. And what that means is that there is a possibility, because Caltrain has among the least financially stable situations in the Bay Area, with its funding coming largely from fares and from 3 other agencies with financial crises, is we could lose the West Bay side of our regional transit network that we have just invested a couple of $2 billion in modernizing. Next slide. The downside that we are facing in this risk, with a deep crevasse between where we are now and recovery, the downside is pretty far down. We could come out of the pandemic with large gaps in the transit network. The infrequent service could remain and not be restored, as we saw in previous recession, leaving the biggest impact on people who are low income, transit dependent, elderly, and disabled that absolutely rely on transit to get around, and leading to major impacts in traffic congestion and pollution that will really cripple our area. So in order to, next slide, So to avoid those worst case impacts and come back, what needs to happen? So the first step in recovering is society and the economy opening back up. As of next week, we're going to start to see San Francisco and San Mateo County open retail for curbside pickup as part of a gradual strategy for reopening. Next slide. But in order to bring people back to transit, there's a lot of science that we need to have a better handle on in terms of what is actually safe. How likely are you to get pick up COVID from touching a surface? One study showed that picking up the infection from a surface is only 1% to 2% of the infections. That's one small study we need to science. What is the risk from proximity, from spending a 10-minute trip versus 60-minute trip? Ventilation. There's a lot of scientific information we need a better handle on, and some things outside of the public transit system. Will we have widespread testing and contact tracing so we're sure or confident that someone else on this bus or train is not going to have COVID? Next slide. Transit agencies have been implementing safety practices. You're seeing someone cleaning up a Muni car, working hard, using the first round of CARES Act funding to keep things clean and improve safety. However, next slide, we are just as a region, next slide please, just starting to get a handle on how those safety practices are being implemented. This is a slide that was presented to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission yesterday, collating what all the different transit agencies are doing, ranging from 100% of them are implementing vehicle sanitizing, down to only 30% providing employee health checks. That 30% of employee health checks ought to be 100%. And even in the vehicle sanitizing, how often are those vehicles being sanitized? How often do they need to be, depending on the type of transit, length of trip? We need to have a better handle of what those standards should be across the region, and a coordinated effort with a leader around the region to understand the science, have standards for those safety practices, and then be able to communicate those to the general public. Being a Bay Area resident, it's really inspiring to see how our public health system has come together with honest, accurate communication, including what the risks are, so that people can make judgment calls about those risks. This is something where we need a coordinated approach in the region. Next slide. And that coordination that we will need based on facts, expertise, science, and coordinated practice is something that we need in a range of areas in order to bring transit back. We're going to need coordination in bringing service levels back. We're going to need coordination. And this is we're going to need a network manager based on best practices that we have learned from study all around the world, from Germany to Portland and Seattle, London, in order for regions to work effectively at the best of times. There needs to be a network managing organization, and we will need that all the more so in order to recover from that pandemic. Next slide. To coordinate service levels, bring back working connections, provide people with convenience and speed and affordability that will be attractive so that people don't get in their cars and create that traffic apocalypse. And not the least, collaboration on funding to bring back service while maintaining the safety, because while ridership and revenue will be suppressed as the pandemic is with us, working all together to bring in the funding from the federal and state levels to be able to bridge that suppressed revenue. Next slide. And we'll turn this to Assemblymember Chiu, who will talk about opportunities at the state and federal level and regional level to bring things together.
Thank you. Thanks, Adina. Thanks, Ian. Now we're going to be turning it over to Assemblymember David Chiu, who, yeah, he's represented California's 17th Assembly District since 2014. He was on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. He is a great Star Wars fan, which I'm personally most grateful for. Thank you so much for being a transit champion, Assemblymember Chiu. Thank you for joining our call.
Thanks, Armand. Good afternoon, transit riders. Good afternoon, supporters of transit. Thank you so much for joining in today. And first thing I want to say is I hope everyone is doing as well as possible and you are safe and healthy at home. I have to say, while Zoom is amazing, interacting with folks in person, what you said, which is I really miss being on transit, on BART and Caltrain and Uni and cable cars. And as someone who has been using transit for my entire life, this has been obviously for many, many reasons a very, very challenging time. I also mentioned I did not buy my first car. I was born a couple of years ago, and I was just starting to introduce my son to transit when coronavirus hit. And now we suffice by literally reading books about trains and buses in our home. And we're building little train models. And every once in a while, I will take him to see Caltrain barrel down close to where we live. So,
Assemblymember Chiu, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just do you mind speaking up or getting closer to the mic? It's hard. A lot of people are commenting they can't hear you.
okay. Should I start again, or we?
I think it's fine, but just speak up. Like right now is good.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah. So that being said, for years, like probably everyone in this call, I've had lots and lots of concerns and share all the complaints that we have about what are the shortcomings of Bay Area transit. And the fact of the matter that we have 27 transit agencies that have been disconnected with different fare schedules, different fares, different schedules, lack of coordination, lack of planning, lack of investments that has really helped to create the challenge we're in right now. And I really want to take a moment and thank the leadership of Seamless, Adina and Ian, who a couple years ago walked into my office and presented this vision. And I thought, this is the vision of where we need to go. And that is what led to the bill that we introduced a couple months before coronavirus hit. I'll take a moment, just really probably a minute, to sort of sketch out what the bill had hoped for, really to do three things. First, to address what we refer to as sort of low-hanging fruit, things that all of our transit operators and the MTC had agreed we should do. Creating a regional map, having real-time transit data, thinking about an integrated fare pass. So one aspect of the bill was to literally mandate things that everyone had said for years we needed to do but haven't. A second part of the bill was to establish a task force to address some of the harder questions for which there has not yet been consensus, but everyone we need to figure out. So who would be the transit network manager? How are we actually going to physically coordinate different systems, et cetera? And then the third part of the bill was going to think about how do we incent in the future with new tranches of money and funding that we were hoping to get the type of seamless and integrated approach that we need. So we had put this bill together, and I have to tell you, I now have authored about 60 new laws in the state of California. There's no bill that I have worked on that has had broader and quicker and more intense public support than this one. And we were very, very excited about moving this forward when the pandemic hit. And one of the things that many of you probably know is all of us, because we were forced to take an unexpected emergency recess, and we have a very compressed time frame in the legislature, very few bills are going to move forward this year. In fact, in the Transportation Committee, over 90% of all bills are effectively being deferred for next year. And the less than 10% of bills that are moving forward out of the first committee are really focused on extending legislative deadlines and very urgent public safety matters that are directly relevant to coronavirus. But we've had very good conversations with the Transportation Chair, Jim Frazier, and his committee staff about what we need to do. And he's committed to me that this is something that he wants to help move forward next year, which is very exciting, something we appreciate. Now, all that being said, so where does that leave us right now? And let me just say a few things that I was trying to think of how I would structure my comments. And I will reflect a few adages about life that I think are relevant at this point. The first is that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. And I think the worst thing that we could do right now with the decimation of our transit system is talk about rebuilding it in exactly the same way. I think there are two kind of top level truths about what's happening right now to transportation. On the one hand, we have seen no cars on the road, or fewer cars on the road, which is great. But on the other hand, we have seen the decimation of our transit systems from a ridership standpoint, as well as from a revenue standpoint. The worst thing that could happen is that people not get back on transit and get back into their cars, as the slides that you just saw indicate. We need to figure out how to get people back into transit. And there will be many conversations about testing and contact tracing and requiring everyone to wear masks and how do we do social distancing. We're going to use best practices from around the world to do that, and that has to happen. But the other thing we need to ensure is that we're not, again, rebuilding the same thing. The structural problems that have caused the pre-coronavirus transit system to be slow, to be disconnected, to be expensive, and not easily accessed by all of our Bay Area residents, but particularly by our low-income residents, that has to change. And we have to ensure that recovery doesn't take years, which it could, but that we figure out how to do these things in months. How do we change the Byzantine bureaucracies that are all of our governments that are not necessarily working as well together as we need them to be? How do we get everyone working on the same page? In the best of times, we can't afford to be spending years of decades negotiating what are the basic common sense policies that I think are reflected in seamless principles. So that's sort of point number one. Point number two, and I'll just mention another adage, there is always an opportunity in the crisis. And we have to take that opportunity in a number of ways. So at this moment, as a couple of transit officials have said, coronavirus has to some degree burned some of our transit systems to the ground. How do we rebuild them? There will come some significant funding conversations. So fortunately, in one of the more recent CARES Act stimulus packages, there was a significant first tranche of money for transit. Policymakers at this very moment are negotiating the second tranche of money. And what I've been saying during this time period is if we are going to see $1 billion or more come down to help jumpstart and resuscitate our transit systems, we have to use that money in a way that helps to build a 21st century seamless integrated system. When you have entire transit agencies that are now at 5% capacity, if we're going to build from say 5% to 50%, do we want to do this in a way that does not involve integration, that doesn't involve coordinating fares and schedules, or do we want to do it and rebuild it in the way that we need to? Again, the opportunity in the crisis. I want to take a moment and thank the MTC, and this is sort of in addition to funding, the second major development that I think is going to move forward the seamless conversation is the MTC recently has decided to establish a blue ribbon task force on transit recovery. And one major element of the work of this task force, thanks to the advocates of seamless and those of you who are on this call, is we are going to be moving this seamless conversation through that task force. And in fact, the task force really is talking about a lot of the things that we discussed in our bill. And for me, as a legislator, one of the biggest compliments is when others try to do things that are in the bill, outside of the bill, because we're not able to move something legislatively, at least for the next few months, to do this work through that task force. And I really want to take a moment and thank Supervisor Jim Sparing from the East Bay, as well as others. Supervisor Sparing is going to be the chair of this task force. I want to thank Teresa McMillan and her staff at the MTC, as well as our MTC commissioners for blessing this. But we really have an opportunity to think big, to think long-term, to think of how it is that we rebuild. And this gets me to the third adage I'll put out there, which is I really do believe that if we do this right, we can find the phoenix in the ashes, which happens to be one of the symbols of San Francisco. When our city burned down in 1906 after the earthquake, we all thought, how are we going to rebuild our city? And obviously, we figured out how to rise the phoenix out of the ashes. I believe that at this moment, while things may seem dark and things may seem gloomy, we have an opportunity with monies that will come down to figure out how to integrate our services in a much better way, how to invest in the parts of our system that are most of need for our riders first and foremost. How do we integrate all the things that we're talking about and really build this seamless future? I think we have to do this. We have to do it quickly. But if we make the right decisions, we will get to where we need to go. And let me end with one last thing, which is there's been over the past decade a conversation in the Bay Area of how do we rise above our individual jurisdictions? How is it that 101 cities and 9 counties can do a better job of tackling the challenges that we have? We have proven in the last couple of months with the decisions by great political executives, mayors around the Bay, working with county health officials, that as a region, we can make decisions that will move us forward, that will keep us safe and healthy, and that will prevent what we have seen as literally the deaths of other parts of the world. We have done that when it comes to healthcare. 2 hours ago, I was on a similar Zoom call with hundreds of housing advocates as we're talking about a regional vision in how we build our way out of the housing and homelessness crisis. At this very moment, I believe there are 188 of us on the Zoom call who believe in a future in the Bay that integrates all the things that we need to do when it comes to transit and will help us build the kind of future that we need to. I'm really optimistic about it. I know it's dark at this point, but it's because of these conversations that we're going to get there. And I'm looking forward to continuing this work with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Assemblymember Chiu. I know your words have specifically given me a new hope, if you will, that transit can overcome this phantom menace of the coronavirus. Finally, I had to do like 10 Star Wars jokes before I finally got a laugh, so it's worth it.
Good night, Toronto.
Thank you. I know many of you have questions for the Assemblymember. Please feel free to post your questions in the Zoom chat or raise your hand in a few minutes so we open up this call to Q&A. Before we do, Ian and Adina are going to provide a little more information about the Blue Ribbon Task Force and outline a few ways you can stay involved in advocacy going forward. I really urge you to listen to that because more than anything, it's not just about being informed, it's about taking action. So thank you, Ian and Adina.
Great. We'll keep this brief so we can reserve as much time for questions as possible. So this Blue Ribbon Task Force is going to include a number, MTC representation, transit agencies, as well as a number of advocacy and stakeholder groups, business, labor, rider groups, as well as Assemblymember Chiu, and other state representatives have been invited to be part of that initiative, which is expected to take approximately a year. We see the ideal outcomes of this as being, within the first 4 months, really working together across agency lines to prioritize how to serve riders safely, develop an emergency recovery transit network that we can implement right away to provide reliable and safe service for our essential workers, and a health and safety recovery plan that we can roll out right away. And then turn its attention in the latter part of its work to really identify those structural and potentially legislative reforms that can result in a permanent shift in practices and funding, and then institutionalize those changes through the creation of a network manager. That is our goal as Seamless in terms of this task force. And we are honored to have been invited to participate in it. In terms of how this task force could lead to governance reform and the funding reforms that we need to rebuild stronger, we've just wanted to share a best case scenario of a timeline going forward. So here you have on the left, a lot of the grassroots and policy research that led over the past 2 years to AB 2057, the Seamless Bay Area Transit Task Force prior to the big gray box of COVID-19. So we now have this Transit Recovery Task Force being led by MTC, and the opportunity for immediate actions to implement seamless transit very, very soon due to this urgent crisis through this task force. We'd like to see this lead to, again, in the later part of the task force work, a proposal for legislation that would actually establish a network manager, and that would actually take us further than AB 2057 took us, not just creating a new task force, but actually putting in place some governance reforms. And that could potentially lead to a subsequent bill in 2022, the establishment of the more permanent framework for a network manager, recognizing that these reforms often takes multiple legislative cycles to fully implement. And finally, this sets us up potentially to resume the fight for a major regional funding measure to expand and improve our transit system in time for a 2024 potential ballot measure, which is, I think, our next best opportunity. So working back from that 2024 timeline, it's really important what we do right now in this task force to make sure we set things up appropriately. So what do we need for success? We need bold leaders, and we need a compelling vision of what we can become. And we're going to continue to advocate for that. We're very happy to see many of our leaders at MTC championing this, and the direction from MTC commissioners to be bold and unflinching in pursuit of this vision of a seamless future. We also know we need expertise to participate. We need the appropriate technical expertise to be involved in this task force. So this is something that we are advocating for, including of those global experts in the process, to ensure that we're not just thinking in the Bay Area, we're looking globally as to how we can do things better. And then importantly, we need you. We need your support. We need you to take the actions that we're going to discuss right now to provide that voice of the rider to make sure these things really happen. Adina, you're muted.
Unmuted twice, double unmute, yeah. So everyone here on this call needs to be part of the solution. This is going to take a ton of work for us as Seamless to do. There is work going on at the federal level, at the state level, at the regional level with MTC and the task force, and at individual agency level. And our job is step by step to keep you informed so that you can take those actions that will keep our leaders on that bold and unflinching path. We've been nominated, and if approved by the MTC, will serve on the task force, and will be seeking to influence that group to rely on that international expertise and really boldly addressing those structural issues and that fragmentation that keeps us, has hampered us in the past and needs to be addressed to deal with this crisis. We'll be working on broadening the coalition. There needs to be many, many groups, organizations, communities, cities, agencies supporting seamless transit, and we're going to need your help to work with all the organizations that you belong with in order to support that seamless transit. And last but not at all least, working together to bring in that federal and state funding that we will need to cross that crevasse. Next slide. So what can you do right now? You can write Congress. As Assemblymember Chiu mentioned, the HEROES Act was launched by Congress this week with about $15 billion for transit, but the amount that is needed is greater. I was just on a call right before this call. The amount that the national transit advocacy community is asking for is $30 billion. We need more than it is in this bill. The bill in the House could be voted on as soon as Friday, but we're hearing that the Senate is pushing back. So we're going to need consistent calls and letters from you to Congress for funding and more funding, and to make sure that this is included in the final package that is passed. Next slide. we're going to need help with funding. This work is being done by people with a large portion of our time, and in order to keep informing you and keep providing that expertise and commitment for structural solutions, we're going to need funding to do that. So those of you who can, we will need your help today. Next slide. Next slide. And lastly, we will need your help to reach out to any group that you belong to, any community organization that you belong to, any agency that you belong to broaden the coalition, sign on to the Seamless Transit Principles so that all of the dozens of supporters can then be speaking up to our leadership and demanding bold change. So far, we have about 30 organizations going on 1,700 members of the public. We will need that broad support in order to have bold and not timid solutions. So I'm gonna, here's the links. We will send this off to you by email after the fact so that you can take those actions today. I'm gonna turn this back to Armand to close this out and lead the Q&A.
Great. So actually, while we go into the Q&A, we're going to do a quick poll we want to show who's going to take what action. We're also going to have, I know the links are in the slides and we'll email them, but we're also going to be dropping them in the chat right now. The 3 links are going to be the ones you see on the slides, the letters to Congress, donate, Seamless Transit Principles. Before we get to the poll, I really want to emphasize, I know that folks are struggling right now, and if you can't afford to give, we understand that. But if you can, we really need your help to make this happen. Adina, Ian, a variety of other like, these folks rely on our support and our fundraising. I know that I've given money. We're going to give more money. It's critically important to do this work. And so you can go to donate at the seamlessbayarea.actionfund.org. Really key. And we're also going to drop the links to the chat right now. Help us meet that goal. We're doing the fundraising campaign right now. It is super key. So if you're going to be taking any of those actions, about to do a poll, please let us know which one you're going to do, which ones you're going to commit to. Great. So we're going to take some questions. First key question I want to ask is, there's a question about highway funding and about how we're going to be dealing with the highway funding. So if we could have Ian or Adina go ahead and read that question and answer it for us.
Having unmuted, one of the valuable things that has happened in the first round of transit funding from the federal government is more flexibility on using transportation funding where it is needed. And that flexibility will be important and valuable at the federal level and hopefully at the state level, because in getting people back onto transit to be able to address our equity needs and our environmental goals, we don't need highway expansion right now, and we do need to bring people back onto transit. And so one of the advocacy goals will be to ensure that flexibility so money can go to running transit to bring the transit system back.
Makes sense. Great. So actually I wanted to respond to something in the chat. There's a colleague of ours who makes a very important point, is like, I didn't do a great job, I think, of explaining what we are fundraising for exactly. I think, Ian, do you mind talking just really quickly about what we're raising the money for?
It is our ability to participate in this process, in this task force. It's our ability to, we are full-time, we have a full-time staff for Seamless, a very small but productive staff. And it's very difficult to fundraise right now. For a variety of reasons, a lot of nonprofits are really struggling. And for us to continue to exist as an organization, participate productively, we need to be able to be doing this full time. We do have a lot of really dedicated volunteers as well. And we will continue to need a lot of volunteers, but we really need the budget to be able to have full-time staff working on this and the stability of that funding for the next year. So this spring push that we're doing right now is really important for us to be able to continue to have full-time staff to do this work.
Absolutely, thank you. And for the record, we have 1.5 staff only in theory but in practice, like Ian and Adina work the kind of hours that we almost have 10. And we need to continue to fund that work, sustain their ability to hold webinars like this, to participate in task force. Like, this is incredibly important, difficult work. Our goal specifically here is to get 200 donors this month, 50 recurring donors, 200 donors, 50 recurring donors. Please give us the transit fares you would have spent otherwise so we can sustain the fight. I know that I have to resort to fantasizing about BART by putting a Zoom background. So because I can't use that money, I'm donating it. Please donate the transit fares you would have spent if you're not spending them, and support us. We are 10% of the way there. We need your help and support to get there. 200 donors this month, 50 recurring donors. Thank you. Again, sorry to keep pushing that, but it is incredibly important. So the next question I want to ask is from Elaine Jacobson. She says that she's asking, where is the finding that 31% of transit riders are essential workers? Where's that coming from?
That was from information that was collated by the National Organization Transit Center.
Got it. And then another question we have along a couple of similar themes. It says, can you please elaborate about governance reforms from Joe Kunzler? One elected board, I hope, merging transit boards, getting synchronized fares. And we also just had a lot of questions about like the general theme that this is adding more bureaucracy rather than streamlining or reforming.
So I'm going to start that and turn that over to Ian. So one key piece about, is this a new layer of bureaucracy? One thing that we found by studying well-organized transit systems around the world is there is a function to coordinate transit around the region. And right now in the Bay Area, this is not something that is being done. This is a gap in our capabilities. What entity will step up to do those capabilities? There's a number of different ways to solve that problem, but there is something missing, and that missing function needs to be filled in order to be able to rescue transit and run efficiently the way that we need it to run. Ian, more ideas on that?
Just that the task force, both the present task force that NTC is undertaking, as well as the AB 2057 proposed task force, has as a primary objective to actually reduce bureaucracy and streamline and analyze the optimization of our agency. So it could well lead to a reduced number of agencies and if it's effective, reducing bureaucracy. So that is very much baked into the objectives. We're starting, we're having these task forces be led by the goal of an integrated, efficient network. I don't know if Assemblymember Chiu, you want to add anything?
Yeah, if I could just, listen, if we were to build a Bay Area transit system, none of us would say, let's create 27 transit agencies to do it. But the fact of the matter is, history and bureaucratic expansion has led us to where we are today. But given that, I think we all know that if we had one network transit manager to essentially help call the shots and coordinate, that would hopefully over time, pull everyone together, and where there doesn't need to be bureaucracy among 27 agencies, we could end that. I've often said, if it turns out through this conversation that we see a number of agencies folding together, merging, coordinating resources, that would be great, but totally agree with Adina and Ian. The goal of this is less bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy has been a major challenge in creating the kind of system that we want.
Armand, you're muted.
I know, somebody just muted me. So another question we've got specifically is on from Thea Selby from the San Francisco Transit Riders Network. She's asking about what is the importance of sort of a consistent communications voice from Bay Area Regional Transit? How important is that, and how do we accomplish that?
This is Adina. That is absolutely essential and existential. I was on a board meeting listening into the VTA board meeting over Zoom last week, Thursday, and VTA, the general manager, was talking about that one agency coming up with a communications plan around public health and a safety plan around public health. Each agency by agency is not going to be effective enough for people who use multiple agencies, and for the region to gain that confidence of riders. This is something that does need to be a holistic approach, not only collating information, but to have leadership to work together on a consistent response and communicate a consistent response to give people the confidence they need to use transit.
I'd like to answer the question in a slightly different way, which is, historically, transit riders have had little voice in Sacramento. I think this is a little different compared to kind of the activism that we see in some of our cities in the Bay. But when I was first elected to the legislature 6 years ago, I was astonished at how few voices there have been for transit, and as a result, how few legislators are speak up for transit. So we have to substantially increase the voice, the influence, the heft, the power of the transit, if we can say the transit movement, to really have the kind of influence that we want, because the status quo interests haven't pushed the agenda that we are looking for. And by the way, I think that has meant that the car culture of California is what dominates at this time. And so if we're ever going to see the kind of change we want, we need, 200 people in this call to become 2,000 people, to become 200,000 people, calling legislators and reminding us that we need to do this. That's the only way this is going to happen. And I want to just give a little plug also for Seamless. When I first met Adina and Ian a couple years ago, I asked them, "Are you guys doing this on a volunteer basis?" And they said at the time, yes. And I thought to myself, and I think I verbalized to them, we really need to establish an organization that has resources and funding to pay for staff who can really come and push, because nothing really changes in the political process if you don't have really organized efforts that are funded and that have real support, so that when Seamless tells legislators, if you don't support this, if you don't fight for this, there'll be political consequences, it's not going to happen. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is for all of us to organize around transit.
Great, thank you so much. I know we saw a lot of questions, but we do have to unfortunately start wrapping up. I want to, if you feel like your questions weren't answered, we'll do our best to sort of address them afterwards with you individually. Also feel free to email us or contact us. We want to stay engaged and involved with all of you. I know there are a lot of questions to get through, and I'm really grateful for everyone. So I'm sharing right now the poll results, which do make me happy. Folks are taking action. So 56 of you said you're going to write or call your member of Congress to call for transit funding and the HEROES Act. I think what's really key is, for a lot of times when folks see this, they're like, well, my Congress member is, Nancy Pelosi, she's already on board with us. But even if someone agrees with you, they may not understand in part of the negotiation how important this is a priority for you amongst the other things. So it's still key to do. Second, making a donation to support Seamless Bay Area. As Assemblymember Chiu said, it is so important. We are all struggling right now. It's a difficult time for advocacy, but it's especially critical. And then finally, broadening the coalition by signing a petition, encouraging elected representatives to pass the resolution, or getting your organization that you're part of to get involved. 45 of you said that. And if there's an organization that has not endorsed the Seamless Bay Area Transit principles, we'd like us to present to them, please get in touch with us. We'd love to talk to you. And so I'd like to just say, any closing remarks from Adina and Ian before we close out?
I don't have anything. Assemblymember Chiu, I don't know if you want to.
Let me just thank everyone again for being part of this, and just say, we know that recovery after the pandemic will. Part of that has to be a well-functioning transit system, and in the future could look, as Adina had described. On the one hand, we could all be stuck in our cars, sitting on freeways for days at a time. Or we could rebuild a system that will be central to how we get around, central to how we protect our environment, central to moving people efficiently, saving times, connecting families, communities, and doing this in a fun way. And I think there really isn't a choice in what we need to do. And I think, as I said before, we've got to move beyond the insanity of what we're currently doing. We've got to take the opportunity in this crisis. We've got to lift the phoenix out of the ashes. And just want to thank you for being part of this. May the force be with you all, and right on.
Thank you. May the force be with us all. I got to catch a train, so I'll be heading out. But I want to say again, thanks everyone for coming. Please continue to share the word. Continue to write letters to Congress, to donate, and sign up for the Seamless Transit Principles. Get an organization you're involved with to sign up for them. I want to thank Ian and Adina for all of the incredible hard work. Let's make sure they get paid. Please donate. SeamlessBarrierActionFund.org. And thank you all for continuing to participate. We'll send an email with more information and follow-up items. And please get in touch and stay involved. Thank you, everybody. Oh, I think I hear my Bart. Bye.
Bye.